Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the fourth weekend of July 2025. I'm your guest host, Cole McNeely. Established in 2019 by the Franklin News Foundation, the Center Square publishes original, taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Devungi, PhD economist. Today, we'll take a look at Trump's latest trade deals. We'll discuss Washington State's growing budget, and we'll hear about the latest on the quote-unquote Russia hoax. And we'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Cole McNeely. With more on trade deals, it's Dan McCaleb.
As President Donald Trump continues to negotiate a trade deal with the European Union, he said this week that he reached a deal with Japan and the Philippines. The agreement with Japan is especially significant as the two allied nations traded goods totaling an estimated $228 billion in 2024. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square tariff guru, Brett Rowland. Brett, let's start with the details of the Japan agreement.
So we don't have a ton of details yet, just as with some of the other trade deals that Trump has announced. Most of them are announced on Truth Social. There's not a ton of details, so we kind of go with just what he puts out. Sometimes the White House has been putting out more detailed information later. We haven't seen that. We've only seen that for the deal with the UK and the deal with Indonesia so far. So the Japan deal, we're just operating off basically a framework or some broad guide rails. So essentially imported goods from Japan will face a 15% tariff. U.S. exports to Japan will be tariff free, which is a big win. Now, there's another part to this deal that has been somewhat overlooked, but Trump also announced that Japan would invest $550 billion in the U.S. Now, what form that investment takes has yet to be seen. Also, Trump is saying that 90% of the profits from those investments would go to U.S. taxpayers and that the other 10% would go back to Japan. But just how those will be structured remains to be seen. That's one of the big question marks on this deal. But Trump is very proud of it. It is certainly one of the biggest, trade deals that he's reached. And it's a big trade deal with a country that has a big U.S. trade deficit. So the deal that Trump reached earlier with, United Kingdom is essentially has a flat trade balance with the U.S. It's sometimes the U.S. has more trade, sometimes the U.K. has more trade. So that one was fairly easy, but the Japan one was more difficult and the biggest one he's reached so far. So it's certainly an accomplishment for him. But again, these are just framework deals,
right? So
we'll have to the rest of what happens will remain to be seen.
Regarding the details that we know, it does seem like this is a win for President Trump. But U.S. automakers do have some concerns about the Japan deal because tariffs on imports from the island nation are lower than tariffs on vehicles from Canada and Mexico. Tell us about those concerns.
Yeah, so this is actually really interesting, and this came up too during the UK deal that Trump reached. So Japan is home to Toyota. Toyota's the top selling brand in the U.S. But so we'll have to see where this goes. But U.S. automakers are not pleased with this so far. Essentially, what the U.S. automakers are saying is that our economies and our auto industry is so closely connected with the auto industry in Mexico and Canada that you're essentially going to charge us higher tariffs than you're going to charge Japan vehicles. And with Toyota being the top brand in the U.S., they're not pleased. Essentially, and this has come up a couple of times before, but recently the mayor of Windsor, Canada, which is a major auto hub that's been connected with Detroit for 100 years. He said essentially the two cities are inextricably linked. Like you can't undo the connections that have been made. And sometimes vehicles cross the border multiple times between US, Mexico, and Canada before they go on sale. So the US automakers are not pleased with this development. And I think that the concern is that if this goes forward with other countries, that they're worried that their bottom line could get hurt on this.
Interesting. Brett, briefly tell us about the deal that was struck also this week with the Philippines.
Oh, that's a good point. So we got some more details about that. So, these Philippines and Indonesia were the other two trade pacts that were announced. Now, these are smaller trading partners, but they still do quite a bit of business with the U.S., billions of dollars in trade. So for the Philippines, Trump is going to have a 19% tariff on imports from that country. Same with Indonesia. He said that both countries have promised to open up their markets to U.S. goods. He said the same thing about Japan too. Now, we don't know exactly what that looks like because Howard Lutnick came out later and said Japan was never going to open its markets the way that Donald Trump wanted them to. And that's why that $550 billion payment came out. So just what exactly open markets means here is one of those things that hasn't been fully elucidated by the White House yet. So we'll have to see, but there's quite a bit of trade with those two countries, 19% tariffs on both, but the lowest we've seen is the 10% for the UK and then 15% for Japan. So what the bottom line is going forward, I think is going to be real interesting. It doesn't sound like Trump wants to go anywhere near. He wants to keep everything at least the baseline of 10%. But other than that, we could see higher rates elsewhere. And it'll depend on how the rest of these deals fall into shape. But Trump has made significant progress this week. At least two big deals and more details on a third. So finally, we're seeing what I would say would be pretty quick progress.
Perhaps the biggest one that's still outstanding is a trade deal with the European Union. There have been reports that the president is getting close to announcing a deal on that. We don't know yet. But thank you for joining us today, Brett. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Brett. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. With more on the Washington state budget, we go to Carlene Johnson.
An article posted Monday indicates that the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services spending since 2015, just in the last 10 years, has nearly tripled. And there is one kind of main driver in that explosion of taxpayer dollars. So TJ, break it down for us.
Yeah. So the spending on long-term care has grown from $3.8 to $12.9 billion. And it now represents half of the agency's biennial budget. And what's going on is that the population of the state is getting older. So there's more people on long-term care. There's more burdens on the system. So the state's just subsequently spending more money on that. Now, DSHS only covers long-term Medicaid. So their spending as part of Medicaid is for long-term care. It doesn't cover other types of Medicaid. So that's pretty much what's going on. And I'm guessing also, they've got the caseloads that have increased significantly for a lot of the people. And if the cost for caring for each of those individuals goes up, then it has a, kind of a tidal wave effect. And, it adds to the reasons for the state spending increases in this area.
Wow. But that's massive expansion. How much of it is just because, you put somebody in, a family member has to go into an assisted living facility or whatever, what the state portion of that's paying for that care. Maybe they live a lot longer than they used to.
Yeah, that's another thing that's interesting is that when people live longer, they are taking they are remaining an expenditure for the state. And this is just one area. For example, if somebody retires at 65 and they are 100 years old, they've been on Social Security for, 35 years. So as opposed to somebody who dies 10, 15 years later, obviously it's nice that they live to be 100. But at the same time, that means more years that other people are going to have to spend money through the state to care for them. And so it was interesting. I found that there was areas where the budget has also increased. developmental disabilities that increased. But what was interesting is that actually the public mental health spending has actually gone down. It was $2.3 billion in the 2015 supplemental budget. And then this current biennium is just $1.7 billion. So, and that's not adjusted for inflation. So not only has it gone down, on face value, it's also gone down if you adjust for inflation as well. So it's an interesting thing to see that not all areas of the budgets are getting an increase.
And more people in, these long-term care facilities, they're on the taxpayer dime versus, now we're required, right, to have long-term care payroll deduction. That's going to be a whole different basket. But I'm thinking of, family members of my own that have been in assisted living facilities, and, this much is covered by, their own savings or whatever plan that they had paid into. And then the state and federal portion kicks in because of their age. It's odd to me. Like, do we have more people that are simply dependent on taxpayers in those facilities, or is it just the costs have gone up greatly too?
The number of eligible Medicaid clients who receive care in state licensed nursing facilities actually went down from 10,000 to 7,500. So that's an interesting thing. But other areas where you have like developmental disabilities, and this is a program under Medicaid, that increased from 15,000 to 17,500. And the time period for that is since January 2017. So this is not a 10-year period like with the spending, but this is this is the timeline in comparison that the Forecast Council uses. So it has shown increases in stuff, but I think what we'd also have to look at is what the costs are for those services and how much they've increased since, 2017. And I have a feeling that amount has increased. But yeah, it's like you're saying, there's people who are dependent on taxpayers to be supported. And, there's a whole separate issue to deal with Apple Health, which is our state Medicaid program, and the number of people who've joined that since 2015, which is significant. So, this is just more financial burdens are being put on taxpayers. Well,
and I wonder if in the years to come, as we're all paying now into this, long-term care payroll tax, which, you and I have both written on, isn't really going to be much to go on when the need arises with the lifetime benefit of 36 grand or something like that, which, if you've ever had a family member in a long-term care facility, that's like, a few months or something crazy. But I wonder if that is it. Can't recall if the goal of that for folks that were proponents of that system was to offset the burden on everybody else because they see this explosion in costs. Wonder, will it get any better because we're all paying into it more?
Well, that remains to be seen. But as we know, spending more money on something does not correlate with increased quality or, efficiency or anything like that. It just means more money is being spent.
And what did Elizabeth New at Washington Policy Center tell you? I know you included some of that in your Monday article. What was her kind of insight on this explosion in costs from DSHS?
Well, and it remains to be seen how this is going to deal with the one big beautiful bill's effect on Medicaid. But she was arguing that the problem with Medicaid is that in her opinion, eligibility is really broad. And we're super generous with what we cover as a state. So that could be also what's going on. Now, her comment applied to both Medicaid and long-term Medicaid. So this is, they're a little bit different, but she was just saying that there's a lot that's being covered. And so that's possibly also the other thing that's going on is just, you have a very generous program in terms of, what it covers and who it covers.
And you also included, we spend a little chunk of Medicaid change here in the state on folks who are here illegally. What's going on with that?
Yeah, that was a separate story, but there's what's called Apple Health expansion, and it is a program that they're spending $150 million on for in the next biennium, and is for people who are not here legally. So they do not, according to the Washington State Healthcare Authority, they do not need to provide documentation because they don't, obviously because they don't have it. So this is a free healthcare for people who are not in the country or the state legally.
And how much are we spending on that?
That's $150 million. And keep in mind, this is at a time when, one, we've got a fiscal crisis as a state. Two, Washington State has chronically undercompensated Medicaid medical providers for Medicaid patients, to the point where a lot of medical providers are no longer accepting new Medicaid patients as a result, because they just can't afford to. They're not being given enough money in compensation for services that they provide. So instead of using that $150 million to fix that, they're giving it to people who should not be here legally.
Thank you very much, TJ, for the fascinating article.
A big thanks to Carlene and TJ. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. With the latest on claims about Russian interference in the 2016 election, we'll go back to Dan McCaleb.
President Donald Trump's Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has referred documents to the Department of Justice related to what she called manufactured intelligence behind the Russian collusion hoax against President Donald Trump in the 2016 election cycle. Gabbard implicated former President Barack Obama in the scandal, using the words treasonous and coup to describe Obama's involvement. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square's congressional reporter, Therese Boudreau. Therese, tell us about these accusations.
Yeah, so Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, she last week released a slew of documents that she said proved that former President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, and essentially the higher ups in his cabinet and in the intelligence agency, purposefully dragged out and investigation into the 2016 election and tried to cherry pick different intelligence and use sources that weren't really trustworthy to delegitimize the first Trump administration, to delegitimize the election. So that's the claim. And what these documents do show is that there were many instances in the investigation into the 2016 election, and specifically whether or not, or to what extent, Russia interfered. And what the documents showed was that there were many different protocols and different rules and just ways of doing things that are meant to help keep bias and errors out of crucial investigations like this. And a lot of those were violated. There are many times these declassified documents that Gabbarb released, it showed that there are many times when even some people in the intelligence communities were saying, hey, this doesn't quite seem right. But we're, the FBI at one point said, we're not comfortable. They wrote in this document, we're not comfortable. Essentially, they said, alleging that Russian President Vladimir Putin interfered in order to help Trump win. There was evidence, and this has been known, that there's evidence that Russia tried to do certain cyber or other influence campaigns in order to just destabilize the process, or specifically to undermine faith just in the U.S. democratic election process, so that whoever became president, people could be doubtful. But basically the reports and the reports that the Obama administration conducted went a step further. This is what Trump and his followers called the Russia hoax. They went a step further, and they said, oh, Putin must have done these activities that we confirm that he did in order to help Trump win. And so what it seems like, the documents that Gabbard has released, what it seems like is that they knew that, or at least they had no proof that Russia and Putin specifically were trying to help Trump win. That was just a motive that the intelligence community slapped on to that information. And so now there's this big uproar from the Trump administration because they're showing, Obama and the people who are with him were trying to, destabilize and delegitimize. And, they threw around, like you said, the terms coup and treason, the duly elected president of the United States by essentially manipulating this investigation that was otherwise sound.
Yeah, those words like coup, treasonous, those are heavy words to be thrown around about a former president. Obama, a spokesman for former President Obama, did respond this week. Just tell us what their response was.
Yeah, essentially, it was a pretty short response. Essentially, they called the accusations a weak attempt at distraction. They said they were bizarre. And the spokesperson said that nothing in these papers essentially provides any new information. We already knew that Russia did interfere, and then he kind of just left it at that. He didn't really address the documents that kind of seem to show that, again, that this was a coordinated effort. It's a coordinated investigation that seemed to go awry, when different biases were inserted, when there was intelligence that was cherry picked or some that was omitted, that seemed to disprove the whole notion that Putin was on Trump's side, so to speak. So so basically the Obama's spokesperson just denied everything but didn't really quite go into the details. So it's unknown at the moment how this will continue going forward. So far, Gabbard's just releasing more and more documents and building on that theory. And she's asked the Department of Justice to kind of look into it as well. But there's no word yet of Obama or Clinton or anybody going to court or testifying about that.
So I know these are just allegations at this point, Therese. But let's assume some of these allegations are true. Of course, under President Biden, the Justice Department brought criminal charges against the then former President Trump in 2023 and 2024. The U.S. Supreme Court weighed in and said a president has immunity when he's acting in his official duties as president. That just sort of muddies the waters, I think. Well, let's say there was some criminal, let's just say the Obama administration did violate some federal laws with this. But could he face actual criminal charges?
I believe.
I know I'm asking you to speculate.
Yes. Again, this is all speculation, but it's possible. We've definitely seen as well in this second Trump administration that things that otherwise seem to not really fit into the normal political paradigm, they happen. It's what you think about that or not. So even though that seems kind of incredible that Obama or other former high-ranking officials could be prosecuted or something along those lines. It is possible that again, speculation, but I get the feeling that with the Trump administration, nothing is off the table at this point.
Thank you for joining us today, Therese. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to Dan and Therese for that story. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What are the economic impacts of hosting the NFL draft? Why did the Trump administration release some of the education funding they were withholding? And will 2025 see a decline in new homes built? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Cole McNeely. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. A federal judge has sentenced Anne Pramaggiore to 2 years in prison and ordered the former ComEd CEO to pay a $750,000 fine. A jury convicted Pramaggiore and 3 others in 2023 of conspiracy, bribery, and falsifying records in connection with a scheme to bribe former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. Pramaggiore is scheduled to report to prison on December 1st. As calls intensify for reform at the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, one state lawmaker is calling for it to be abolished. In an exclusive interview with the Center Square, State Rep Steve Cara, a Republican from Three Rivers, said reform and lawsuits aren't enough. Currently, investigations are underway into the Michigan Economic Development Corporation after a Governor Gretchen Whitmer political appointee and donor was set to receive $20 million of taxpayer funding for her Oakland County-based nonprofit. The U.S. Department of Education has paused student loan forgiveness with no clear timeline of when it will resume. The income-based repayment plan is a student loan forgiveness plan that allows individuals to make payments based on their income and to receive forgiveness after 20 to 25 years of continuous payments. It was unexpectedly paused by the Education Department while payment records are being updated to reflect recent court injunctions that halted loan forgiveness. The Biden administration launched a loan forgiveness program, the Saving on a Valuable Education Plan, but it was found to be illegal. IBR is currently the only loan forgiveness plan not facing legal challenges. High school seniors continue to apply for federal aid in the face of deportation risk for their immigrant families. With the rise of deportations across the country, California college-bound seniors faced a difficult decision this past spring. They had to decide whether to submit a federal financial aid application despite fear the government would use the personal information to identify parents who are illegal immigrants. 12% of American children, or about 9 million people, are citizens with at least one non-citizen parent, according to KFF, a nonprofit health policy research, polling, and news organization. Thomas More Society attorneys are appealing a U.S. District Court's denial of a preliminary injunction protecting a Catholic pro-life clinic's right to speak about abortion pill reversal. On behalf of Culture of Life Family Services, a San Diego County-based pro-life pregnancy center, Thomas More Society is challenging California Attorney General Rob Bonta's effort to protect pro-life pregnancy centers from speaking about a lawfully available treatment that could reverse the effects of the abortion pill. Culture of Life Family Services filed a verified complaint for declaratory and injunctive relief in 2024 asking for permission to share abortion pill reversal information to its patients. Almost a year later, a district court denied Culture of Life Family Services motion for preliminary injunction on June 23rd. Thomas More Society attorneys are appealing the decision in the San Francisco-based U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. You can find more of these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Tired of news that tells you what to think rather than what to think about? At the Center Square, we bring you the reliable, credible news you need focused on what actually matters: government accountability, taxes, and the decisions affecting your community. Our award-winning newsroom cuts through the noise to deliver fact-driven journalism you can trust. Stay informed. Visit thecentersquare.com today and subscribe. Once again, that is thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Cole McNeely. With more on the impacts of the NFL draft, it's J.D. Davidson.
You might not know it with the heat wave currently gripping a lot of the country, but it is football season. And for the National Football League, it's always football season. Joining me today is John Stife, Wisconsin reporter for the Center Square and one of the leading reporters on publicly funded stadiums and tourism impact of those stadiums and the events that follow. That's what we're jumping into today. John recently published an exclusive story that detailed the actual economic impact of the NFL draft as it travels the country from year to year. John, let's start there. Tell us about that report.
So one of the things that happens every year is that a host city will come out with what it says is the economic impact of hosting this event. And what they want to do is say, hey, a bunch of people came here, and they use an exit survey from a third party company to do that. They ask people while they're there saying, hey, we're staying for 3 days, we're staying at a hotel. And then they put that into a formula that multiplies all the expenses they would have over 3 days, the hotel stay, the food, any other entertainment. And then they say, look, this thing brought $120 million in this case into Wisconsin was the claim about a week ago. And so academics, when they look at something like this, they look at it as an equation and they say, well, let's compare last year when you didn't have the draft and how many people stayed in the Wisconsin hotels in the summer. You know, it's obviously a landing spot for a lot of people to go visit Wisconsin. It's beautiful in the summer. People go to county places like that. So you compare the two things. There hadn't been academic literature about the actual traveling NFL draft until this last week. And an economist in Georgia at Berry College, his name's E. Frank Stevenson. He looks at hotel data around the country and kind of analyzes it. He's been working on for more than a year looking at the NFL draft and how it's traveled since it went to Chicago in 2015 and left New York City and what that impact is on each city. And the result is, not surprisingly, that there aren't a lot of extra people that go to these cities for the actual NFL draft. It's a lot of people who drive in for the day. They come for a couple days, they leave. And then there's actually less people in hotels the third day of the draft, the day after the draft, 2 days before the draft. People that would normally come to a city don't go to that city because they're avoiding the big event.
You know, it's interesting. We're not saying that there isn't an impact overall of a city having the NFL draft. And, you know, interesting that, you know, the NFL started to move that draft when it sent it to Chicago. Two cities that likely wouldn't get a Super Bowl until they got a dome. So it was Cleveland. It was Pittsburgh. Vegas had it. That would be the one that I could think was maybe an outlier. There's pride in having the draft in your city. It's a neat thing. But what we're talking about is the actual economic impact. And then, John, talk a little bit about what the actual cost cities have when putting on an event like this, whether it's this or the Super Bowl or the political convention or anything like that.
The costs are usually in between 10 million and 20 million, probably closer to 20 million, in costs, because a lot of the things you already have, like you have the big venue, you have spaces where you could have a bunch of people, but they go in, they build stages, they build barricades. Like in Green Bay, they did it all in the parking lots. And so they built up this whole area out there. And one of the largest expenses is the additional crowd control, the public safety, the additional costs to have EMTs there and to have police there and to be able to do all those things. So the states will come and grant money. I think Wisconsin sent $2 million recently to just the 4 law enforcement agencies, the county and the cities involved, that had extra expenses related to this. But that was just part of the cost. It's not high cost. And what Stevenson's paper ends up saying is, you know, I'm not saying it's bad to have this or it's not a little bit beneficial, but the problem is that the conversations that occur surrounding this are not close to reality. The reality is the revenue wise, because hotels cost more, they raise the prices. Hotel companies make $4 to $6 million additional when they bring it in. Most of them, except for Las Vegas, which had 20,000 less hotel rooms booked during the 5-day span of the draft, compared to if it wasn't there at all. Because other people that are going there for other things just don't come.
So you also wrote pieces not only about Green Bay, but specific pieces about Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Vegas. In the short time we have left, tell us a little bit about what those showed.
So Philadelphia hosted, I believe it was 2017, and they made big claims about that there were 18,000 additional hotel rooms. The reality is that maybe 19,000 hotel rooms were booked, period. And that didn't take into account people that are usually there. And they were attributed that all to the draft, even though the pen relays were there, all these other things. The reality is it was like, the same amount of hotels booked as if the draft wasn't there. And they made a little bit more money. In Las Vegas, like a lot of the sporting events that have come to Las Vegas outside of the Super Bowl, it actually cost them in hotel rooms because people didn't come to do other things. The big one on that was the Grand Prix, where they shut down the roadway and interfered with everything else. And then still the prices went up and less people came. But it was similar with the draft. 20,000 less hotel rooms were booked during that 5-day period. Why it matters is when coming up next year, Pittsburgh is going to host the draft. Same state. They're asking Pennsylvania for money. They already have $11 million for the additional expenses, and they're going to come ask for more. 1 million of that came from the state, and the other come from like local tourism agencies, and which get state money to do it. And the year after that is going to be on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And we've already had a press conference about how that's going to be great. And the president even saying, oh, this is going to be the best one yet because it's on the National Mall. It's going to be more prominent than anything we've ever seen.
You know, it's a great story. And like we said at the top, we're not saying these events are bad. We just, the honest reporting that you're giving us and the honest look at publicly funded stadiums about major events and about the tourism spend that goes along with it, that's valuable information for people to make decisions on. John, thanks for joining us. And you can read more about this as well as see the entire report on thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, JD and John. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. With more on the release of some federal education funds, we'll go to Eliana Kernodle.
The Trump administration released $1.3 billion in education funding back to the states after some bipartisan pushback. Joining me to tell us more about this is the Center Square's education reporter, Esther Wickham. So last week, the big news on this front was that after the Trump administration said it would withhold $6.8 billion in federal education funding, several states sued the Trump administration. Now this week, some of that money is being released. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, thanks, Eliana. So at the beginning of this month, on June 30th, the U.S. Department of Education sent emails to various education state heads stating that this amount, $6.8 billion in federal funding, was not going to be dispersed for the school year. So this created a lot of panic and chaos, wondering, why is this being withheld? What's going on with this? So for the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of discussion back and forth on what's going to happen with this funding that's been withheld. Currently, 24 states, along with the District of Columbia, came together in a coalition to sue the Trump administration over this money being withheld. And this is all in an effort to continue in steps to dismantle the Department of Education, which is something that Trump has been wanting to do since he stepped into office. And so with this lawsuit, a lot of these education officials are wanting this funding to come back because they believe that this funding is necessary for education programs across the state. And so with this lawsuit, it was really interesting because this past week, the Trump administration, specifically the U.S. Department of Education, announced that they were actually going to be releasing $1.3 billion. But they had a caveat. They had a catch, because according to the Office of Management and Budget, when I spoke with them about why they froze this money, why they withheld it, they stated that a lot of the programs that this funding had gone towards when it comes to all the states had been used to push different values and different ideologies that went against the Trump administration. So with this new plan in place, they're releasing, a small amount with the caveat that the federal government is saying that these funds must be allocated towards allowable activities. And I put quotation marks because they did not obviously specify what those allowable activities entail. But if the states do not follow that specific guideline, the money will be revoked. So it's really interesting because it's kind of just a small step in the direction of, okay, we're going to give you this small leeway in the funding that we have been withholding for the past 23 days. And we're going to see, what the states do with it.
And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's been some bipartisan pushback that kind of led to this release. Can you
get into that a little bit?
Yeah. So after there was a lawsuit, a lot of pushback from specifically Democratic lawmakers and as well as more liberal leaning school districts, there wasn't really much to say on the opposite side. You know, the Republican Party wasn't really saying much. Some people supported this. You know, they think that as a whole, the U.S. Department of Education is not really necessary, and they want that, you know, access and that control back to the states to be given. But 2 days following that big lawsuit, a letter was signed directly to the director of the Office of Management and Budget for the White House, Russell Voigt. This was led by 10 U.S. senators, specifically U.S. Senator Shelley Moore, who's a Republican for West Virginia. These 10 Republican senators urged the administration to unfreeze the education money and send it back to the states. So in the letter, they said, quote, "We share your concern about taxpayer money going to fund radical left-wing programs," right? Because that was the main reason why they froze the money in the first place. But they continue to say that, however, we do not believe that this is happening with these funds. So they're basically saying that the withheld money supported programs that bipartisans support. So they're saying that, you know, this reasoning isn't valid. These programs are necessary. A lot of the funding does go towards special ed programs or disability programs. So that's kind of their fear. So this has kind of been a big reason why people think this partial money has been restored to the states, because it was only a few days after that the $1.3 billion was restored to the states. But the story still continues because education officials are saying, okay, what are you going to do with the remaining $5.5 billion? So not clear. That's still an ongoing story, but the states have small amount. They have not clarified how much is actually going to be divvied up among the states. When I reached out to the California Department of Education, they had said that they had received the news, but they had not gotten the grant award notification in funding to see how much specifically each state would get from that $1.3 billion. And again, what that specific allowable activities caveat is provided within that money giving back to the states.
Well, Esther, thank you for your insights on this story, and I'm sure you will continue to follow this as it develops. And you can read Esther's work at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you to Eliana and Esther. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. With more on declines and new homes built, it's Chris Krug.
Joining me as always, Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. You had a post, and it's single family construction plunges as builders hit the brakes is the headline on your story. Your data point, single family housing starts fell 4.6% in June, are now 10% below year ago levels. And while multifamily construction may have found the bottom, the total number of homes added in 2025 will likely fall short of last year's activity. And then you have a link to the latest data. But then you go on to say, in 2023, so we're just looking at 2 years ago, 1.8 million new families were formed, but only 1.4 million new homes were added. Tell me what's going on with housing right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, you got an increase in housing inventory basically due to a slower home shopping season, slower than most people anticipated. Housing inventory has increased over the past year, is now up about 17% from a year ago. The increase in the number of sellers, right, existing homes, resale homes coming on the market is basically providing some competition for builders, right, which they basically had been the only game in town for the past couple of years, right? And so that's also slowing down builder sales, right? And as builders are, kind of struggling to sell off their inventory, you get, they pull back, and you're starting to see it. Single family housing starts fell 4.6% in June and are now 10% below where they were a year ago. So you're starting to see, single family housing construction really pull back, slow down considerably.
because of the increase in housing inventory. Now there's some good news. The good news is multifamily starts increased. The multifamily sector may have hit the bottom, right? Remember, we had a big decline in rent growth, over the past couple of years, due to a big surge in construction. Well, now that renters have more bargaining power, renters could potentially start moving again. The multifamily sector started to think, well, eventually, when we think about when those buildings started today are going to hit the market, we may actually have a bit of activity. And so they are starting to think about, and I say think about because I don't really believe that you're seeing a big increase in construction of multifamily buildings. I just think that they've hit the bottom and people are going to start to think about, okay, when do we start adding new apartment buildings again? Right. And so I think that's what's going on in this report. Now, the pullback in single family starts is somewhat unfortunate because as a country, we're still facing massive housing deficits, right? According to my estimates in 2023, the latest American Community Survey data that we have available, the deficit was 4.7 million units, right? So 4.7 million units, an increase from 4.5 million the year before and about 3.9 million back in 2019, right? So how do we get a deficit? Well, if more families are added to this country or formed each year, but the number of housing units for rent or for sale does not increase by the same amount, then you end up with a deficit. And that deficit has been piling on every year. And so now we're looking at being short roughly 4.7 million units. How does it show up in the data? It shows up in the number of families that are stuck, doubling up, living with non-relatives, right? Across the country, there are about 8 million families that were living basically in tight quarters with a group of people that were not related to them. Some people might prefer that. I'm not saying that's not true, but the reality is if you look at those families, they usually lower income families, which hints to me that many of those families, if they had the means and if they had the available housing, they would probably prefer to have a home of their own. And so that's kind of how I look at it. And of course, if you think about where these deficits are the worst, they're the worst in places where building is very costly. They're the worst in California, San Jose, San Diego, San Francisco, Boston, Los Angeles. They're the worst in places where there are lots of jobs that people want to go and work and fill, but there's just not enough housing being built, right? And the main reason why there's not enough affordable housing being built is because it's just too costly to build there. There are too many restrictions and regulations that prevent builders from building efficiently in those markets, to basically absorb or at least fulfill some of those housing gaps.
A big thanks to Chris and Orfe. That will do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Cole McNeely, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.